Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Galbraith, and I'm the curator of the Cary Graphic Arts Collection here at RIT. My colleagues and I are currently busy planning for our next year's series, so our 2022 Cary Online event. Keep an eye out for our social media and other types of announcements to see what we have in store. Today, we welcome back virtually to the Cary collection, Hannah Paivo, who joined us this past summer as our 2021 Summer Research Fellow. Today, she presents on her research with a talk titled Dots, Graphs, and Pictograms, the Visual Vocabulary of Social Facts. Just on a personal note, Hannah joined us this summer during a time of a little bit of upheaval in the Cary as we were transferring to a different location in the library. And I just would like to say thank you again, Hannah, for being such a wonderful guest and being so accommodating in the midst of the hurly-burly. So by way of a formal introduction, Hannah Paivo is a PhD student in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. She specializes in 19th and 20th century design and architecture with a focus on the history of graphic design and information visualization. Hannah holds a BA from Sonoma College and an MA in modern and contemporary art history with a concentration in design history from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her work has appeared in Design Issues and Public Art Dialogue, and she has contributed to exhibition catalogs on various topics in modern and contemporary art and design, including Serious Play, Design in Mid-Century America and Scandinavian Design in the United States, 1890 and through 1980. In addition to her fellowship at the Cary, her research has been supported by the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Hannah, thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to see you again, and I'm happy to turn things over to you now.
Steve, and thank you all for being here. I will go ahead and share my screen. So today I will be discussing 3 graphic forms that have historically been used to visualize statistical information in the social sciences, with the aim of showing you how graphic designers have borrowed and adapted them to other contexts. These forms are dots, graphs, and pictograms. And during my time at the Cary collection, I tried to collect as many examples of them as I could. By showing you some of what I found, I hope to convince you that over time, these formats have come to express a certain kind of social scientific authority that can be evoked wherever they appear, regardless of whether or not that particular appearance is actually referencing specific information about an actual population, any concrete social facts. When I say social fact, I am referring to something quite specific. Social fact is a term that first appeared in the 19th century. And to understand its emergence, there are 2 important and connected developments to consider. First, the discipline of statistics came into being in the 19th century. And second, the scholarly field that we now call the social sciences started to take shape in their modern form. And these 2 developments are closely related. Although we now think of statistics as a very flexible set of tools that can be applied to essentially any discipline or topic, in its initial formation, statistics was intertwined, first and foremost, with efforts to study society and the so-called social more generally, both of which are concepts that also came into being in the 19th century. To say that society came into being in the 19th century is not to say that people or communities suddenly rearranged themselves into so-called societies. Rather, what I mean is that Western scholars began to think, write, and talk about this new concept of society in the 19th century. Previously, the dominant thinking was that there was, on the one hand, individuals, and on the other, the state, which was represented by the sovereign. There was a direct line between one and the other, as suggested by this famous frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' 17th century treatise, Leviathan, which shows individuals amassed together to form the body of the sovereign. Society, on the other hand, as it was conceptualized by people like Adolf Quetelet and Emile Durkheim in the 19th century, was thought to be an additional layer of organization between individuals and the state. It could be characterized by other sorts of systems and institutions, like families and religious groups, and studied by information about employment, literacy, marriage patterns, etc. All of these bits and pieces of information about this thing called society came to be known as social facts. The word fact in this term gets at the idea of something positive and empirical. And when the term social fact emerged in the 19th century, it generally signified quantitative measures of society, such as birth rates, crime rates, or population totals. In other words, social facts were largely statistical in this period, and much of the early development of statistical methods was undertaken with the goal of measuring society in mind. These are the relationships that I'm referring to when I say that social science and statistics emerged not just concurrently, but together over the course of the 19th century. And what I'm particularly interested in is that almost from the beginning of these endeavors, scholars also work to visualize social facts through statistical graphics like the ones you see on your screen. Some of the formats they began to use in the 19th century are familiar to us today, such as the bar graphs and pie charts you see on the left. Others came and went, like the image on the right, which shows the ratio of church denominations relative to each state's population, and also has this interesting, easy to miss gray border around each little chart that corresponds to a state's population that has no church affiliation. I'm interested in how these images work in terms of the nuts and bolts of the formats, but even more so in what they do. What meanings do they produce? What role do they play in the larger history of social science? And how have the visual tropes, habits, or patterns of statistical graphics been transferred from the specific context of the social sciences to other kinds of graphic material? These were the guiding questions that I brought to my fellowship at the Cary Collection. More specifically, I wanted to build on research that I had been doing revolved around this book series. Began in 1968 and called Studies in American Negro Life, the series covers were designed by the well-known New York design firm Chermayeff and Geismar Associates. When I first encountered them, I was struck by the arrangements of dots, in part because they seemed to have this strange combination of pictographic and diagrammatic qualities. For instance, the arrangement of dots on this book by Lewis R. Harlan, Separate and Unequal, is diagrammatic in how it represents abstractly the ideas of separate and unequal, by showing one brown dot separated from a cluster of many white dots. Other examples are pictographic, by which I mean their dots form recognizable images that relate to the book's content. But there are also something about these images that struck me as statistical. The way that on these two covers, a few dark brown dots appear among many white dots seems to be suggesting something like a ratio of relative populations of each race. Of course, these aren't actually statistical graphics because they aren't built on any underlying data, but they nevertheless evoke statistical graphics. And I'm interested in understanding how this came to be. How did dots come to conjure data? Once I started looking for dots in statistical graphics, there was no shortage to be found. For instance, here I'm showing you on the left a map by the French civil engineer Charles-Joseph Menard. This image depicts the amount of goods that pass through various European ports in a given year, and the relative size of the dots corresponds to these values. And on the right is one chart from a series that W.E.B. Du Bois produced for the American Negro exhibit that was shown at the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris. Here, color-coded dots are used to indicate the social class of the county's Black residents, thereby creating a visual pattern of socioeconomic and racial distribution in the region. Dots also show up in social network diagrams, a format introduced in the 1930s by sociologist Jacob Moreno and still in use today. In this format, dots represent individuals in social networks, while lines show the connections between them. But the use of dots in the social sciences that I am most interested in is the dot map, a cartographic format that assigns each dot a certain number of fixed individuals, say 300 people for each dot. I was very excited to find examples of dot maps in the Cary Collection, like this one, which come from a book called Metropolitan Los Angeles, One Community. The book was written by urban planner Mel Scott and designed by Alvin Lustig for the Hayes Foundation, a Los Angeles-based philanthropy that sponsored research and education in the fields of sociology, economics, and government. This particular map was originally made by the LA Planning Commission and was then reprinted in the book. It shows the population distribution of LA in 1946, and what's important to note is the line under the title that explains each dot represents 200 persons. This strategy, the amalgamation of several hundred individuals into one dot, is the basic premise of the dot map format. So here's another example where it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. This one shows the population of Chicago in 1912. And again, each dot represents 200 people. We're seeing a visual representation of a region's population. And we're seeing it not just as a total number, but as something that's distributed in geographic space. The overall pattern of the dots, as well as their variable density, creates an image of Chicago's population that is concentrated in the downtown city center and radiates outward in a way that seems to support the proposed subway lines that are shown in thick, dark lines. But let's go back to the Metropolitan Los Angeles book. I was interested to see that it also includes this other kind of map that uses dots. And now this is not what a cartographer would call a dot map, because the dots don't represent groups of people. But instead, they each correspond to an airport. And the size tells you what kind of airport it is. The color indicates if it already exists or if it's being proposed. And so you get these interesting little target forms where there's a proposal to modify or expand an existing airport. And also, unlike the dot map, which, as I said, it came straight from the LA Planning Commission, this one was based on a map by the Planning Commission, but was redrawn by Lustig, as were many of the other maps in the book. And eventually, I do hope to locate the original Planning Commission maps in order to figure out exactly what Lustig copied or what he changed. But even without that comparison, it's useful to know that he was not just encountering, but really looking carefully at these kinds of images. So I'll come back to these maps, but first I want to step back and give you a sense of where else dots show up in the Cary collection. They're not just on maps. They appear on magazine covers, in corporate annual reports, fundraiser invitations, etc. In the hands of graphic designers, mid-century dots are playful, they are humorous, and they create visual interest. One of my favorite ways that they appear is like this, where on a film brochure and the cover of a Tennessee Williams play, they seem to reference the kinds of illuminated theatrical signs that are made of lots of individual light bulbs, which Walker Evans once captured so well in this photograph of Times Square. And as I continued to find more and more examples of dots in the Cary collection, my question became why? Why so many dots? And is there any connection to the statistical dots that I had been following in my previous work on the studies in American Negro life covers? I don't believe that there's any one explanation for 20th century graphic designers' affinity for dots. But a big contributing factor, I believe, is that the dot has long played a prominent role in typography and printing more generally. This Yale Literary magazine offers a sense of how dots are part of typography's visual lexicon. The dot is a formal component of exclamation points, semicolons, and other punctuation marks that appear here within the white dots. And there are also many examples, like this product catalog designed by Jean Federico, where a designer has dramatized the typographic dot itself. But there also seems to be something about the dot that leads designers to use it as a building block for grids. Arranged in neat columns and rows, the dot is no longer just a typographic form, but becomes part of a larger pattern or even structure. Used in this way, we might think about how the dot makes visible the underlying grid that is often associated with so-called monorized typography. But there is also a more specific visual reference for grids of dots in the realm of printing, which is the halftone. Halftone printing is a process that was introduced in the mid-19th century, and it made possible the mechanical reproduction of photographs and other images with gradient shades. Previously, these sorts of images would have to be approximated through laborious techniques like etching. The halftone enabled such images to be reproduced more efficiently and also more accurately, at first in black and white and then later in color. To make a halftone, you photograph an image through a screen, which produces a pattern of various sized dots that appear more or less continuous to the human eye. In general, the idea is to minimize how noticeable the dots are. But graphic designers have long taken the opposite approach in certain instances, exaggerating the dots as a mean of creating visual interest. In short, graphic designers are no strangers to dots. The dot is a building block of typography and printing. But there were many instances I found in which I felt that there was also something else going on, where the dots I was seeing were not just engaging with the idea of dot as typographic form or dot as printing technique, but also with dot as statistical form, in a way that seems to recall their history as a social scientific tool for visualizing populations. This is an example of an object in which I believe we can see the graphic designer engaging with the statistical dot. It's a 1952 publication that Lou Dorfman designed for the NBC radio network. Titled Measuring Radio Sales Power, this slim booklet has the appearance of a children's book and presents an accessible summary of a recent market research study that had been carried out by NBC to determine the frequency with which listeners actually purchased the things they heard advertised on the radio. So before I delve further into this object, I want to explain a little bit more about how this book connects to my broader concern with social science. So essentially, there's a significant connection between market research and social science. The beginnings of what we now call market research can be traced to the end of the 19th century, as companies and independent consultants began to apply methods that they borrowed from the social sciences to business practices. They borrowed methods like surveys, interviews, and the collections of consumer spending data, but it all remained rather unsystematic until the 19th century, when corporations began to establish formal research departments and certain individuals formed independent market research firms. These firms were generally staffed with a mixture of marketing specialists and social scientists. And various strains of sociology, psychology, including psychoanalysis, had an impact on market research techniques. And so I understand market research as a very important point of connection between social science and corporations, and by extension, the graphic designers who work for them. So this NBC book is exemplary of such connections because it's an example of a graphic designer stepping in to visualize both the methods and findings of a market research project. As the book describes, the study was initiated by NBC's Director of Plans and Research and directed by psychologist Dr. Thomas E. Coffin. NBC hired an independent research firm to carry out the fieldwork, which consisted of over 8,000 interviews with radio listeners in Davenport, Iowa, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. The study's findings were summarized using a metric they called the ESP meter, with ESP standing for effective sales power. The book describes this as a, quote, useful gimmick that gauges in cold percentage figures how well an advertising medium does its job. In other words, the ESP percentages convey how much more likely an individual who has heard a given radio ad is to purchase the advertised product than one who has not. And as you can see, dots are a key element of how Dorfman has visualized this metric. Here, a pointer on the ruler labeled ESP points to somewhere around 52%. The dots just below correspond to the percentage and are connected by a network of lines to the figures of a salesman, his wares, and a family of potential buyers. These dots don't really operate particularly consistently throughout the book, but there does seem to be a particular connection drawn between the metrics of the ESP meter and the senses, with dots often appearing at the figure's eyes, mouths, and ears. As the book moves through findings for particular products like Alka-Seltzer and pet milk, dots continue to appear as mouths and eyes, but also as buttons, cat food, and other colorful accents in the playful illustrations. And though these dots are used in a rather unsystematic manner, their very presence in this public-facing document of early market research is intriguing. I'll return to the issue of market research a bit later, but first I want to circle back to the Metropolitan Los Angeles book. This book provided an excellent starting point for me because it not only included dot maps, but other sorts of social graphics as well. So here's another figure from the book, where Lustig has transformed a basic line graph of population growth by adding a photographic background of a crowd. To me, this image calls to mind the kind of social documentary photography of the 1930s. And so we're simultaneously confronted with two different modes of social representation. On the one hand, we have the graph as a geometric abstraction of society, but at the same time, we're looking at a figurative representation of a thing that's been abstracted. We might ask if this enlivens or enriches a viewer's understanding of the data presented. I don't think it necessarily personalizes it, given that we see no faces, only tops of heads and hats, but there is a sort of peculiar overlapping of two different representational traditions here, namely the abstract and the figurative. Lustig had previously encountered this sort of experimentation with the line graph format when he designed an earlier Mel Scott book called Cities Are for People, the Los Angeles Region's Plans for Living, which also featured drawings by Bob Holdeman, such as this one. This image reads as a line graph, but it's not actually based on specific data. Instead, it uses the line graph format to dramatize the Great Crash of 1929, with a jagged line that presumably represents stock prices, careening up and shooting back down and crashing through the x-axis. A troubling cloud hangs over the early years of the Great Depression and those leading up to it. And below, a row of men march underneath the graph, their heads bowed as if bent by the weight of the economic hardship that is abstracted above. I'll come back to these sorts of pictographic figures, but first I want to show you some more examples of things like this that look like graphs but don't actually represent any data. So the Cary's Lou Dorsman collection has a wonderful assortment of CBS letterhead. And as you can see here, the various CBS divisions would each get their own version of any given overall graphic theme. Sometimes it was just a matter of varying the color palette, as in the set on the right, but in other cases, the designs were more specifically tailored to the specific department. This set, which probably comes from the late 1960s or early 70s, includes a couple of star-studded rainbows for the specials and primetime divisions, a pile of balls for sports, and at the bottom are two designs for the marketing, information, and national sales departments. So this is really where we're getting back to the history of consumer market research that I was discussing before. Here is a closer look at the bottom two letterhead. Both have jagged lines that pretty clearly evoke line graphs, and specifically line graphs that show an upward trend. In the top example, the idea of national in national sales is included in a sort of thick slab in the rough shape of the United States, while the line represents perhaps the ups and downs, but mostly ups, of sales numbers. The bottom example for the marketing information department includes a similar line. But here, the line crosses a background of four cartoonish faces shown in profile. And I suppose the idea here is that the division is concerned with gathering information about people, or more specifically about viewers. And it's sort of unclear to me whether this line also indicates increase in sales, given that it does have an upward trajectory, or if it's just sort of meant to represent quantitative market research data more generally. In both cases, what I find interesting is how little it takes to evoke a line graph. Here, we do not see clear X or Y axes, no indication of scale or labels, and yet I think most viewers would look at these and think, line graph. Another example is this set of letterhead and business cards that Dorsman designed for the Marketing Science Institute, or MSI, a market research organization established in Philadelphia in the early 1960s, which later moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it partnered with the Harvard Business School. Dorsman's designs turn the M and I of the Institute's names into a figure resembling a line graph, using color to distinguish between the two letters and nestling the middle S within the negative space in between. In doing so, he created something that operates as a logo. And as with the CBS letterhead, this design is meant to make us think of numbers and data, and most of all, of a scientific approach to marketing. This is not about the kind of creative marketing genius that we associate with Madison Avenue. It's about a data-driven approach to marketing that takes the tools of social scientific research and applies them to sales. In addition to these sorts of images that only look like graphs, there are also many actual graphs to be found in the Cary collection. Corporate annual reports are full of them. I'm showing you these two particularly bright and colorful examples because the argument I'd like to make about these real graphs is that their inclusion in these corporate reports is just as much about the appearance of data as it is about the data itself. While in these cases, they do actually visualize numerical figures, they also play other roles, creating visual interest in the documents and also signifying a sense of scientific rigor and authority. The connection between corporations and graphs is also suggested by the peculiar repetition of this form, which appears on a book cover on the left and on a conference folder on the right. It strikes me as a sort of grid/bar chart that displays a more consistent idea of growth than the jagged line graphs I've shown so far. And I'm really not quite sure what to make of this yet, especially because it also shows up on this cover for a book on Soviet economic reforms, seeming to suggest that this kind of economic growth that the form evokes is not confined to capitalism. But setting the question of capitalism versus socialism aside, my point here is that these examples all show how the overall form of statistical graphics can operate in the absence of actual quantitative data. So having looked at dots and graphs, I'll now move on to pictograms. Pictograms are meaningful graphic symbols that bear a visual resemblance to the thing that they refer to. The symbols for men and women in this design are some of the most common pictograms that we encounter. Other recognizable examples include the international symbol of access and the radiation warning symbol. To consider how these relate to social facts, I'll return us once again to the Alvin Lustig books. So we already looked at the line graph. It's not really a graph. And on the right is another example of how these little figures appear in Cities Art for People. This image illustrates the idea that during a war, for every one man on the front lines, there are 10 men engaged in industrial production to supply him. And beyond that, there are numerous others, men and women, working in various fields to support them. I expect that for some of you, these figures will quickly call to mind the graphic language known as ISOTYPE, which stands for International System of Typographic Picture Education. ISOTYPE was developed by the Viennese intellectual Otto Neurath beginning in the 1920s and disseminated throughout Europe and the United States over the next few decades. Neurath conceived of ISOTYPE as a system of visual communication that could transcend language barriers. It eventually consisted of over 4,000 symbols, which Neurath referred to as modern hieroglyphs. And I've included the chart on the bottom right, which compares US and global car ownership, really just to give you a sense that these weren't all human figures. ISOTYPE was primarily used to communicate quantitative information about a society, which you'll recall is a type of information that has been historically referred to as social facts. The way this worked is that a symbol was made to stand for a specific number of things. So on the left, we have these little groups of 4 figures, each of which represents 25,000 unemployed workers. Their hats and overalls are meant to help us recognize them as such. And in the upper right, each little couple symbolizes 100,000 marriages. It's interesting to think about how this relates to dot maps, which share this idea of representing a certain large number of people with a fixed symbol. But unlike dot maps, ISOTYPE figures bear an iconic relationship to the thing they represent. And rather than plotting them in geographic space, in these charts, symbols are arranged in lines that correspond to a month and a year. And so they convey a change over time. And there's also this interesting practice of using partial symbols when the numbers demanded it. In the unemployment chart, some lines end with groups of only 1 or 2 men instead of 4. And in some cases, Neurath would even slice straight down the middle of a symbol, as you can see in the car ownership chart at bottom right. So as I said, ISOTYPE was disseminated internationally, including to the United States. But beyond Neurath's supervision, it was often taken up as an idea rather than as a rule-bound system. So looking again at Alvin Lustig's Metropolitan Los Angeles book, you can see how on the left, he follows Neurath's approach of lining up several identical symbols, even using the partial cutoff figures. But on the right, he represents population growth by expanding the dimensions of a single symbol, which is something that Neurath specifically said should never be done because it would be unclear to viewers which of the symbol's dimensions to consider. Its height, its width, its area. Basically, he thought that this tactic would be imprecise and confusing. As such, it's perhaps unsurprising that rule breaker Alvin Lustig is not a central figure in the history of ISOTYPE in the United States. That role is generally assigned to Rudolf Modley, a Viennese immigrant to the US who had been an assistant to Neurath in the late 1920s before immigrating to the United States in the 30s. In 1934, Modley established his company, Pictorial Statistics Incorporated, which he renamed the Pictograph Corporation in 1940. Modley's work is found in the Cary collection, specifically in its Spiral Press collection, in the many newsletters, brochures, and other printed matter of the 20th Century Fund. This organization, which still exists today under a different name, was a nonprofit public policy research institute that hired Modley to produce graphics for many of its projects. For example, this spread shows figures from a 1964 report on the economic future of the United States. The report used pictograms to visualize things like the nation's population growth, average family income, and college enrollment. And what I want to insist on is that looking at something like this is a moment of us encountering statistics in the context of pictograms. So today, even though we often encounter pictograms in a signage context where they play very important roles, we're not really seeing anymore the statistical use of them as commonly. But in the early to mid 20th century, pictograms very often visualized social scientific information, AKA social facts. So finally, I'd like to bring back these various strands of dots, graphs, and pictograms together by looking at some covers that Rudolf de Herrick designed in the 1960s and 70s for Family Planning Perspectives, a magazine published by Planned Parenthood. I was very excited when I came across these covers in the Cary's de Herrick collection because they demonstrate so many of the things that I've been thinking about. At the top left, there is an example of overblown halftone dots. And next to that is a sort of pseudograph that refers to a cover story on abortion trends. And there are also at least half a dozen examples that incorporate dots as an illustration of the birth control pill, sometimes in clusters, but also often in grids. And of course, there's an iconic relationship happening here because dots are a pretty obvious way of abstracting a pill in 2 dimensions. But I'd also like to suggest that there's something else going on, that the dots are also evoking a sort of social scientific sensibility. After all, a pill was initially understood and developed as a tool for population control. And so while these images certainly make reference to actual physical pills, they can also be understood in relation to population statistics and practices of social scientific visualization on a more conceptual level. And finally, there are covers among these that use pictograms. As with the dataless graphs, these do not literally depict statistical information. But considering that the image on the right illustrates a cover story on world population growth, I think it can be argued that these figures partake in the graphic language of social facts, specifically population statistics. Interestingly, the human pictogram is also present in a bit more abstracted form in the logo that de Herrick designed for the magazine around 1974. And there's actually an interesting pattern of similar logos for various health and humanitarian institutions in this period. So looking at these, I do think that it's more difficult to perceive the connection to statistical information than it is with the graphs or the dots. The question of whether or not viewers would actually pick up on the eco-social statistics in these logos is an open one for me. But this question becomes all the more interesting when comparing de Herrick's logo to an advertisement that he designed sometime in the early 1970s for the Container Corporation of America's Great Ideas of Western Man series. For this series, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the CCA enlisted numerous graphic designers to create ads that illustrate quotes from celebrated Western thinkers. This one from Emerson's 1870 work, Society and Solitude, reads, "The true test of civilization is not the census, nor the size of cities, nor the crops, but the kind of man that the country turns out." Emerson is suggesting that social scientists with their census numbers and crop statistics get something wrong in their assessments of the nation. And so de Herrick's illustration might be taken as reinserting a human quality, symbolized by a red heart, back into the pictographic symbol of statistical man. And finally, I'll leave you with this image surrounded by an assortment of reminders of how dots, graphs, and pictograms have been used both to visualize social facts, but also simply to conjure their presence in various ways. These forms have been used by social scientists, market researchers, and graphic designers as tools for depicting social facts, as well as visual signifiers of a sort of scientific authority, rigor, or precision when it comes to analyzing social subjects. My time at the Cary Collection allowed me to identify certain habits of 20th century graphic design that relate to these concerns. And I very much look forward to expanding on these preliminary observations in future research, as well as answering any questions that you may have about them today. And so with that, should I unshare the screen or should I keep it up? What do you think, Steve?
Maybe unshare to get us started, but you might pull up images after, depending on the questions. But first of all, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm so excited to see what kind of questions we might have. So let's, please feel free to start putting questions in the chat, or if you just want to write the word question, we can ask you then to unmute and then ask your question. I'm happy to get it started, but my question is more of a library question. I hope you wouldn't mind that. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm so struck by the content that you were seeking to find in the Cary collection, even the title, you know, dots, graphs, pictograms, and visual vocabulary. It got me thinking about visual vocabulary and the kind of the sort of subject headings and different keywords that librarians and catalogers and archivists attach to design. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a lot of work being done on this by archivists to try to well, try to make this sort of research easier in a way. So maybe you could comment on how you went about trying to find these elements, and then kind of maybe comment on how we could do better at describing collections to help encourage this sort of research that isn't often captured in our subject headings. I apologize for the long question, but I hope it came out okay.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. So I mean, I started, I kind of, before I arrived at the Cary collection, I had some ideas for how to do this, and they included looking through catalogs and looking for clients that I suspected might have something to do with this. So anytime that there was a nonprofit organization that was engaged in research on societies or communities, I thought that there might be some things in there. Moments when I was looking at a lot of educational institutes, thinking that there would be sort of maybe advertisements for their sociology or their psychology departments. But what I found is that when I arrived, those were only minimally helpful. And what really ended up helping me the most was to just kind of take as broad of a look at a collection as I could. And I consistently found that the most useful things were the things that I hadn't expected to find. I think the best example of that is finding all of this stuff from the 20th Century Fund and all of the pictograms by Maudley's Corporation in the Spiral Press collection, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a collection of a printer. So it's quite different than, it's organized quite differently than many of the other collections in the Cary collection, which are basically organized by designer. So I think that tells us something about kind of an alternate way to go about doing research, looking at printers versus designers and various ways of organizing these things. But I think that ultimately it was having the time with the collection that the fellowship allowed me, that is what allowed me to go kind of step away from the catalogs and the keywords that were used there, and to just find things I wasn't expecting. The Planned Parenthood magazine covers were another instance of that, where I had known that, that maybe there would be something useful there, but I had no idea how helpful it would be. And I mean, I think that the question of how to better make these things searchable perhaps comes down to thinking more creatively with keywords and tagging. I think that there's a lot being done that's sort of borrowing the hashtag from social media and moving that into library connections or collections. And I mean, it would make my life a lot easier if dots were hashtagged in the entire Cary collection. But I mean, that alone would be an incredibly massive project to undertake, to go back through all of this already cataloged material and to start adding keywords based on things that we haven't really been thinking about yet.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, it's something we talk a lot about in Cary in terms of cataloging and different genre form terms that, might get our researchers closer, using a catalog. So thank you for that, and know that we're working on it too. And then we have a wonderful both comment and question from Bess Williamson. Bess, would you want to unmute yourself and ask yourself? Would you like me? Oh, there. Okay, there you are.
Hey, hi, Hannah.
Hi.
I'll just read my comment. You mentioned some do's and don'ts for, I realized I wrote isotopes instead of isotopes. I'd like to blame autocorrect for that, but I'm not sure if it is. But anyway, are there other opinions or guidelines about the ethics and dangers about data visualization? Like, I was just thinking that fundamentally that upward moving graphic is kind of a, like a false promise, right? Mm-hmm. It's not based on anything.
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think partly the false promise of the growth is something that was not being shied away from. There was definitely a desire to, only put in your corporate reports a graph that's going to reflect on you positively. What I have encountered, and I think there's probably more work to be done in looking at sort of technical and manuals about this, or kind of information advice sort of things. But what I have found is that there is this idea that every graph should really only present one idea, kind of assuming that you shouldn't expect your viewer to spend time parsing the image. You should really be creating things where it's going to be just one single piece of information. So you'll see especially in corporate reports, like pages of graphs that potentially could have been combined into a sort of more comparative image that are really parsed apart. And I think that there's probably a lot to be thought about why we should, why there was a desire to sort of simplify as much as possible. But it does probably connect back to the sort of discourse in the 19th century about how statistical graphics were meant to make, to be engaging, meant to make things easier. And I think we often encounter today and in historical examples, things that are not at a glance images. They are something that actually takes time to kind of look at and parse and understand what's going on. So I think that there's, I appreciate the kind of direction to pay more attention to the sort of do's and don'ts, but those, I would say that kind of like make it simple, make it easily graspable, even to the detriment of kind of being specific or particular in how the data is being shown, is something that was kind of consistently messaged and showing up when graphic designers were talking about these things.
All right, and thank you, Bess, for that question. The next question comes from Nina, who is asking, have you looked at dots on record album covers?
Yes, Nina, thank you for that question. There are tons of dots on record album covers, and I have sort of been I've been collecting dots kind of wherever I've found them to appear, and sort of categorizing them. And I think that there's various things that make this feel like I kind of had to narrow it for this project in terms of like focusing on the social scientific dot. But I do wonder about the moments where you're seeing it in music, where you start seeing it in like ads for IBM, where the dots are related to computers. And I don't know if there's really, I don't personally know enough about the visual language of music composition or even just transcription to really understand if there's a kind of direct relationship happening and if the dots are being used as specifically or more just in kind of a decorative pattern sort of way. But I would love to see any more examples of dots on album covers that you want to send my way, because I'm definitely interested in the fact that it's not just that they're happening in this kind of social scientific information avenue in mid-century graphic design, but that they come up in various places, which I was nodding to with the sort of like theatrical dot. But I think that the musical dot is another interesting example that could be looked at to think about if there are connections happening between these various spheres.
Thank you, Nina. Do you have any follow-up to that answer before we move to the next question? But if not, that's okay. It's just fun to. There you are.
At jazz, there's a lot more use of dots in jazz than in other genres, and I too have a collection of graphic album covers. So I'll have to search and find all the dots and send you pictures.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I'm sorry to talk over you there. And so next up, we have Natalie Wright has some questions. Natalie, would you like to come on? I'm also happy to read.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Am I speaking loudly?
Yep.
Okay, great. Fantastic job, Hannah. This is so good. Just super exciting to see this work coming together. And I think I was just making connections between what you said and some of the things that I've been finding, at least in terms of clothing design. There's a lot in the 1940s and 1950s. I've seen a lot of discussions around like scientifically constructed clothing, often for particular kinds of populations, whether or not it's stout wear or for clothing for people with disabilities or women's work clothes. They're often discussed as kind of scientifically constructed. And I just wondered if there was sort of a larger culture that you're pointing to in your research of kind of if something is associated with the social sciences, then it has kind of greater currency. And it's probably an obvious question since you've just taken us through all of this, but I just wonder sort of kind of why that might be the case, I guess, or why in this particular time this is happening. And then just a comment, maybe you've seen this already, but Jennifer Roberts, her Mellon lectures that are online. She goes into one of them, goes in really specifically about the halftone that I think you would like a lot, about its sort of history and the kind of metaphorical resonances of halftones in printing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that the Jennifer Roberts work on this sort of printing techniques is something that I find very useful in thinking about these sorts of things. So I'm glad that you see the connection there as well. And as to your question about, the rise of the social sciences, yes, I think that something I'm interested in doing is connecting the history of social science to these other sorts of things. You can read a lot about the sort of rise of social science in the 20th century, its institutionalization. It's, various fields can be looked at together or separately, sociology, psychology, what's happening in the various fields. But overall, there is sort of this kind of seemingly historical sense that they really came to have a greater authority, and especially in terms of wanting to align themselves with biological and natural sciences. So it's sort of like this step-by-step process where first the social sciences are kind of in formation in the 19th century, and then they start to really borrow the sort of more natural scientific approaches in the 20th century. And then from there, it becomes this sort of interest cross-culturally, whatever, in many different avenues in sort of buffering your research or buffering your claims, so to speak, with this. So I think that what you're seeing in the fashion design is definitely in line with what I'm seeing in graphic design of various sorts. And I think that it is, there's probably like a much larger project here of thinking about how the sort of form that the social sciences took in this period, both sort of institutionally, but also kind of in pop culture more generally, is a project that's like kind of in the works, needs to happen, something that I hope continues to be happening in the near future. Yeah.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Hannah. So the next question comes from Jake Kratsley. Jake, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I'm happy to read it as well?
Yeah, sure. So my question is compared to the time period, because I noticed that a lot of the examples that you had given were from 50s, 60s, 70s era. How do you think we're using dots, lines, and isotypes today, and how do you think we're going to use them in the future? And how does that kind of go along with the social? I forgot the language now. The social sciences that you've got.
Thanks. I think that's a tricky question for as a historian. I don't want to overly analyze what's happening today or predict the future necessarily, but I do think that the kind of like larger implications and argument of what I'm looking at and tracing suggests that these sort of meanings that have become kind of layered into these sorts of images since the kind of early 20th century, if not before, are still with us today, even if they're not necessarily being understood as such. And so we very often encounter data visualization that is using graphs, that is using lines, it's using dots, and there is a whole lot, I think, that is kind of historically piled up in that I would like everybody as a kind of viewer and consumer of statistical graphics to be aware of. Beyond that, I do think that the kind of field is interested in rethinking some of these things. And there's, arguments that dots shouldn't be used to represent people. One of the kind of striking arguments I've seen about this in sort of recent history is when the New York Times published the names of people who had died from COVID, and the designer specifically said we didn't want to use dots to represent this. And so there does seem to be an interest in kind of humanizing these sorts of images. And I think that it's interesting that is in some cases coming up sort of in a not necessarily historically informed way. And I really would like to insert that sort of historical view of it into the contemporary conversation about how best to visualize these sorts of things. So yeah, that's sort of dots and lines. I think that the isotope, again, is maybe the case in which it's the most difficult for us to see how there is perhaps a statistical history to these things. But given that we are in a moment of sort of rethinking a lot of the symbols, like the International Symbol for Access, which has been recently redone to give a more active kind of image of a wheelchair user, things like this, I think that there's a lot of, it's really worth inserting this sort of historical view into the contemporary debates, because I think all of these things are going to continue to be used.
Thank you, Jake, for that question that brought us up to the contemporary uses. That was wonderful. Are there any other questions for Hannah in the moment here?
I have a question.
No? Okay, Shani. Wait,
First
are
of
you the
all,
real Shani? No.
I am.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this, Hannah. This is fascinating on so many level, and it's such a pleasure to hear the questions and kind of realize how vast this kind of visual representation of something can go. So, but my question is a little bit different, and I actually wanted to ask you about the graphic design archives at Cary Collection, because you had this wonderful opportunity to be researching very different collections. So you went looking for a graphic visualization within different designers. And I was just curious to know if you've noticed anything in common, if you kind of had any thoughts in terms of the network between these designers that were practicing at the same time, sometimes the same locations, sometimes for the same clients. So just kind of an open question about your experience going and exploring different collections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's thank you. That's very interesting, because it certainly, I had some reflections on that as I was putting together these slides, because I was looking, moving back and forth between collections in a way that I wasn't necessarily doing when I was doing the research. And it was interesting to note, for example, that with the logos that kind of look like a human pictograph, to see that there was one designer, Burton Kramer, who was doing 2 of these in perhaps the same few years. Someone else did something that looked quite similar. And you have to imagine that they're looking at one another's work and, know what's happening. And I think that that's certainly the sort of professional networks that you could imagine happening through things like AIGA and various sort of like formalized professional networks. It's interesting to see how those actually play out in the work that's produced. And I would certainly say that I don't know if they're necessarily, corresponding with each other about the specifics of borrowing from the social sciences, or if they were talking about Neurath and they were talking about Maudley amongst themselves, is something that I would definitely like to pursue further in the future, because what I sort of often found is that every time I kind of stepped away and started looking at writings and even letters, things that were kind of explicitly talking about what they were doing and their own practices, which are, a big part of the Cary collection, that like the dots started sort of to disappear. I wasn't finding people talking about doing this stuff explicitly. It was much more in the actual graphic material itself that I was able to find things that were relevant. So I don't know if maybe this kind of direct communication with one another about how they were going about this is just somewhere out there for me to find that I haven't found yet, or if really this is sort of like an under the surface. And while everybody's talking about how to create corporate identity design and how to make a really good logo, they're not necessarily talking about this sort of stuff. So I'm glad that's a question for you, because it's a question for me as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. And thank you again, Hannah. I remember first reading about the direction of your research when we first started communicating and feeling so excited for this topic. And just so to see this presentation today has been just really delightful. And I'm very excited to see where this continues to go. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope that to see you again next year when we have a new lineup of Cary Online programming. And if there's no other final questions, I just want to wish everybody a peaceful and safe holiday season. And and a happy new year. And again, I hope you'll continue to join us for these Carry Online events.